When it comes to following God in obedience, when it comes to seeking to truly worship Him, there is following God, there's leaning upon Him, there's trusting in Him, which is what that song that we just sang is all about. But there's also this temptation to follow other things. There's a temptation to trust in other things. There's a temptation to be pulled aside and to center our lives not around God and His promises, but something else. And the word for this in the Bible is idolatry. What do you think of when you think of the word idolatry? The author and the influential pastor, Tim Keller, who just passed away last year, the year before, he had this to say. He said, "To people today, the word idolatry conjures up images of primitive people bowing down before statues. The biblical books contain vivid images of the cultures of the ancient world. Each city worshipped its favorite deities and built shrines around their images for worship. Deities were represented in every public space." He says, our society today is not fundamentally different from these ancient ones. Each culture, including ours, is dominated by its own set of idols, things that we worship, things that we hold up instead of God. He says each has its priesthoods, each has its totems and rituals, each one has its shrines, whether office towers or spas and gyms or studios or stadiums, where sacrifices must be made in order to procure the blessings of the good life and to ward off disaster. What are the gods of beauty and power and money and achievement but these same things that have assumed mythic proportions in our individual lives and in our society? We may not physically kneel before the statue of Aphrodite, he says, but many young women today are driven into depression and eating disorders by an obsessive concern over body image. We may not actually burn incense to Artemis, but when money and career are raised to cosmic proportions, we perform a kind of child sacrifice, neglecting family and community to achieve a higher place in business and gain more wealth and prestige. There's one author one pastor actually, who he's also an author. He's written some books. But there's one pastor, an author, who says simply, when you take a good thing, you make it a God thing, you center your life around it, says then that's a bad thing. You take a good thing, you make it a God thing, and that's a bad thing. In the New Testament, Colossians 3 verse 5 speaks about greed, which is idolatry. So if you think of idolatry and you're thinking of statues and pagan deities and altars for worship, you've actually only got it half right. Idolatry is anything that becomes the center of how you make decisions other than God. And so this morning, we're going to take a look at Daniel chapter 3. You could flip open to that in your Bibles if you haven't already. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 3, which is a historical account of literal idolatry. There is an actual statue and worship and offerings and an altar, but behind the surface, there are a lot of the common little everyday idolatries that you and I see all the time, maybe even that we have in our lives. And the central important question of Daniel chapter 3, which the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar was confronted with back in his day, and Daniel's friends and all of the people that were gathered together, the question that they had to sort out for themselves is this one fundamental important question, which is, what is most worthy of your worship? Now most sermons on Daniel chapter 3, they tend to focus on the famous friends of Daniel, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. I almost messed that up because with our own children, we have the three famous figures of Shadrach, Meshach, and off to bed you go. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But this morning, I think we'll get a little bit more out of it if we actually take a look at the real main human character, so to speak, of Daniel's chapter 2 to 4, because this is history, but it's also a narrative shaped in a certain way by the prophet Daniel to tell us something important about who God is and what He's doing in the world. And the way that Daniel wrote Daniel chapter 3 is that in every part of this chapter, the only individual represented here, the center of all the action, the one whose viewpoint is the main one represented, is not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's Nebuchadnezzar. He's the main figure. And we'll see in the next chapter that Daniel eventually grew to have great respect and affection for him as a leader and a friend. And as we dig in this morning, we'll see that in this chapter, God is graciously pursuing the wicked and the proud and the idolatrous King Nebuchadnezzar, just like he pursues us and extends grace and loves and redeems you and me and all the people of the world to himself through the free offer of grace and forgiveness that's only made possible by what Jesus did on the cross in our place for our sins. Amen? All right, and so go with me to Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 1. And we look at the idols that Nebuchadnezzar sets up. Here's what it says. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height it was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, two things are important for understanding what's going on here. The first is the last chapter where Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar there'd be 4 kingdoms would come after him, but he would be the first of those kingdoms, represented by a statue with a head of gold. And so here, Nebuchadnezzar makes a monument to himself, to his own kingdom, a statue made entirely of gold. And he makes the people bow down to it. The second thing is, historically, we know from history that early on in his reign, at about this time, Nebuchadnezzar had to put down a political rebellion where many of the leading officials, including a certain Babu Aha Edina, but Babu was executed. And so what's happening here in this politically trying time is a loyalty test. Nebuchadnezzar, has heard Daniel's interpretation of his dream. He has been told that he is the golden head of the statue of 4 kingdoms, and other kingdoms will come after him. But Daniel hadn't mentioned any of his descendants. And so it's possible Nebuchadnezzar thinks that this means his kingdom will end with him because of some kind of rebellion or disloyalty, and so he's going to find it out. And maybe he thinks, I'll prevent this vision from coming true. I will find the one who will not bow down to my symbol of authority. I will find the one who is least excited about serving me, and I will remove him before he removes me. See what's going on here? And so this idol, even if it is a statue that people are required to worship, it isn't really about the command to worship Babylonian gods like Marduk or Nebo or Aku. It's really about the command to worship the Babylonian gods of control and acceptance and security and comfort. I'm actually going to just write these names because we're going to get very familiar with them over the next few minutes. So the gods behind the gods, the names behind the names are control, acceptance, comfort, and security. And if you're thinking, Pastor Sean's writing is funny, I know. So there is control and acceptance and security and comfort, and these are the things behind the idol. These are the idols of the heart. And so there's the idol of control. This idol says, I only feel good about things. I only have worth. Things are only okay in my life if I'm in charge, if I'm there to make sure that things happen the way that I think that they should happen. And then there's the idol of comfort. It says, I just want to relax. I want to have peace, and I want to feel good. I just want to get my needs met. There's the idol of acceptance. It says, I just want to be recognized and appreciated. I want to feel important. I want my name to mean something. I want people to like me and think good things about me. And then finally, there is the idol of security. So many people spend their whole lives just working to make sure that they have enough for tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, and their whole lives look like gathering things together so that they'll never be short. And these are the idols behind the idol. In the field of biblical counseling, this well-known distinction between surface idols, things that you seem to be chasing on the surface of your life, such as the false worship of the love of money or unhealthy relationship attachments or anything else, as the things that our lives revolve around, has at the root usually one of these root idols of control and acceptance and comfort and security. And so here's what this means. If someone, for example, struggles with the surface idol of greed, and then they say, I want my life to revolve around money, that's unhealthy, that's not honoring to God. If they don't dig down into the root, they might conquer that only then to move on to, say, an unhealthy codependent relationship. And the reason they do this is because they think their real problem is worship of money, but their real problem deeper down is actually the worship of one of these other things. The person who struggles with greed, but at its root is actually the worship of the God of acceptance, is actually using money as an offering to the false God of acceptance in order to obtain a blessing. That person thinks if I have enough money, people will think well of me. People will know that I'm doing a good job. People will know that I'm taking care of everything that I should. They will recognize me and accept me. And if they deal with greed without dealing with the deeper issue, they'll just find another way to seek acceptance. And this will just show up in another way because that person has not really moved on from anything at all. They've just exchanged one symptom for a different one. And so these four root idols of control and acceptance and security and comfort, they're generally the four that are at the root of everything else. And let's see this in Nebuchadnezzar's life. Let's see this happening in Daniel chapter 3. Not only are they at the root of our idolatries, they are at the root of the idolatry of Nebuchadnezzar. See, because it wasn't really about setting up a statue to Marduk or any other deity. They're not named in this chapter. It's just a statue. What does it represent? Well, maybe for Nebuchadnezzar, it represented control. It was about whether people respected him, whether he got to call the shots. Maybe it was about comfort. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar set up the idol because if people gathered around and they came and they bowed down and they worshiped him and he was important, maybe then he would get his needs met. Maybe he wanted to celebrate and have a party and get some loud music going and have a bonfire on the beach around the river Euphrates. Maybe he was a thrill seeker. We see it in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar was a short-tempered man, that he was unstable, and this can often come out when someone who worships comfort isn't getting their comforts met. Think of a toddler in the cereal aisle of a grocery store. I do. Thanks for that. Or maybe for Nebuchadnezzar, this statue really represents at the root the idol of acceptance. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar grew up and he had struggles over his kingdom, and he had to be a general first, and then he became a king and he had to earn his name. Maybe he just wanted people to have certain things in mind when they thought of the name Nebuchadnezzar, and maybe that was what the statue that he set up meant. Or last of all, maybe what was really behind the statue that Nebuchadnezzar set up was his own need for security, because Daniel had said that he was the head of the statue. He was the golden head of the statue in his vision in the last chapter. But maybe the idol behind the idol that Nebuchadnezzar sets up is security. And so if he can get all of the people of all the nations to bow down before him, if he can figure out who might be disloyal and he can remove them, then he might be able to cover all of his contingencies and have everything covered and be secured. Maybe that's what this statue, this idol, is all about. See, we often attach the idea of idols like the one that Nebuchadnezzar sets up here in this chapter to names like Marduk and Baal and Aphrodite and Wotan and Zeus and Allah and Brahman and Chukwu and other names of famous gods, small g gods throughout the modern and ancient world. But often idolatry really comes down to one of these root idols, these objects of much of our worship, of acceptance and security and comfort and control. And so let's dig in now. Here's what happens in chapter 3, starting at verse 2. Nebuchadnezzar sets up his idols in verse 1. And now starting in the next verse, he starts reinforcing them. Here's what it says. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that the King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music." It's like this comically large list of things that are being summoned here and named. "You are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace." Verse 7, "Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that certain time, Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever." They're sucking up to him. Verse 10, "You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Here's what happens. The kingdom of Babylon is the kingdom of the world. It is set up in opposition to the kingdom of God. It is powerful. It is impressive. It has got all the latest technologies. It has got all the best education. Everything that you could want from a kingdom of the earth. But it makes claims upon the people of God. It calls those who would come into its kingdom to be more like everyone else there and to worship what they worship and to be unified in that way. And maybe you have felt the same pressure before, whether at work or flipping on the TV or signing up to volunteer for a community activity or even taking your kids or your grandkids to the library. You can feel the values of the idols of Babylon, so to speak, are making a claim. We're, in a sense, being commanded to fall down before the current, the fashionable idols of the culture with everyone else. Or if you don't, you'll be singled out. And it gets to us because there's multiple things that idol can touch. Why wouldn't we want to look and think and act the way that everyone else around us does, even if it doesn't lead to happiness? If we don't get with the program, it might hurt our position. Life could get very uncomfortable. And that's something that we still feel today. This is why Daniel wrote it down, because it's not about Nebuchadnezzar and his idol. It's about all the idols of Babylon. Whom will you serve this day? And so here's what happens. Nebuchadnezzar reinforces the idols. So first he introduces the idols. Then in this section, he reinforces them. How does he reinforce the idols? Well, he does this in verses 2-3 by calling the cultural leaders to idolatry. See, if you can get the leaders of the people first, if you can get the influencers, the respected people, those with followings on social media, those who seem respectable, then the rest of the world will often follow as well. Because you get to the point where you look around you and you notice there's no one else around me. There's no one else in my neighborhood. There's no one else in my family who seems to think these things. But when I turn on the TV and everyone who is a cultural or political leader, everyone who's a celebrity, everyone who has a position of importance, everyone who is a journalist seems to have a certain message that they're all saying at the same time, it's almost like it's been taught to them first. So that when you go and look, you see all of the most important people and the most respectable people seem to think one thing, even if that thing seems demonstrably untrue, even if no one outside of that group of highly respectable people thinks that thing is true. And that thing, that cultural message just sort of appears all of a sudden. It doesn't gradually catch on and get hashed out and have a range of public thoughts present about it in the way that ideas normally do when they're making their way into the public. They just appear all of a sudden to have universal acceptance and support amongst cultural leaders. And so when you feel like you're the only one who doesn't think that way, even though what you're seeing is only being preached through a TV screen or a phone screen, but when you go around the neighborhood, no one else seems to really think that way, the idols of Babylon still make a claim on us today. It still happens. The next thing that Nebuchadnezzar does to reinforce the idols is he uses peer pressure. And so look at this. He calls everyone to a public place. They all get together. Everyone can see each other. They're all gathered around. And even though it's a forced action, people notice around them more and more people bowing down. They notice that the space around them is getting pretty open as people are down here and they're the only ones standing. They're realizing more and more that they're sticking out and there is pressure to conform. Number 3, in verses 6 to 7, to reinforce the idols, Nebuchadnezzar then lays out a punishment. And so there's influence, there's peer pressure, but now there's punishment. He says anyone who does not bow down before the idol that he has set up will be thrown into a burning furnace. So not only will people not think well of you, not only are the most important people all doing this other thing, but things will go badly for you if you will not bow down and worship the idol of Babylon. And then finally in verses 8 to 12, there's people in positions of power who manipulate things for their own advantage. This traps us into idolatry because there's a temptation to play their game. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they had positions of authority. They could help people. They could line things up for others. And maybe there was this strong temptation to say, look, if I don't seem to be on board with everything, then there's this other group who will use that against me, and I will not be in a position to help others. Imagine how easy it would have been for them to say, maybe I will just bow down to the idol. Maybe I will just play the political game so that I can continue to help other people. That must have been going through their minds. Because there's these Chaldeans that come up, and what does it say that they do? It says in verse 8, therefore at that certain time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews, and they declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You've made a decree, every man who hears the sound of the music shall fall down and worship the image. Whoever does not shall be cast into a fiery furnace. And then the accusation comes. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. These men pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods. They do not worship the golden image that you have set up. Faced with this, maybe if you're them, you think, well, I have to. I have to, because if I don't, then others will come after me. If my values don't look close enough to the values of Babylon, I might not be in a position to help others. And so these things lay their claims on us all the time. And it's not just a thing that we're fighting in our heart, but there's cultural pressures to turn to these things too. There's a cost to worshiping God and to serving Him alone. Here's what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego say, starting at verse 16. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, who we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Even if he does not save, we still will not bow down. We will not worship. We will not follow these things. We will not be controlled by our need to be in charge. We will not be controlled by our need for your acceptance. We will not be controlled by the threat to our lives. We will not be controlled by our need to be safe. We have a God who is higher than that, and he is able to give all of those things, and he is worth more than any of these things. You have nothing to offer me. That's what they say. Think of the pressures that they were faced with. Not just whether they would bow down to Marduk, but whether they would willingly give up their own comfort and their own position and their reputation and their lives. Think of the amazing amount of pressure that would be. And in that moment when Nebuchadnezzar summons them, and he gives them a chance, by the way, and he doesn't give many people chances. This is not a guy who gives a lot of second chances. But he summons them, and he doesn't take the word of the malicious accusers. He summons them, and he sits on a throne, and he says, is this true? And he gives them another chance to do the right thing according to him. And what they say is, we can't do this. We can't do this because there is a God in heaven who is able to save. But even if he doesn't save, we will not bow down before your idol. The kingdom of Babylon makes a claim on their lives. It says, will you get with the program? Will you stop being proud and arrogant? Will you stop trying to be different from everyone else? Will you stop trying to think that you're a special case? Will you just do what everyone else is doing already? And they say it's not about any of that. It's not about me. It's not about arrogance. It's not about being against anything. It's about being for God. There is a God in heaven who is able to save. And now because of that, because that is true, that trumps everything else. See, if the claims of Babylon are true, if Babylon really is the kingdom of surpassing value, if it's the highest of all kingdoms, if Nebuchadnezzar really is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, which is what he called himself and what he demanded others call him, if that's true, then this life is all there is. If that's true, and you're not seeking to make a good life here in Babylon, then you're a fool, and you're going to live and die and have nothing to show for it. That's the claim of the kingdom of Babylon. But here's the claim of the kingdom of God. God says that because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and he is God who sits on his throne, and he is in control of all things, and he doesn't answer to anyone else, but that the whole history of the world answers to him and is under his control because of all of those things, because all of those things belong to him, then seeking after power in this life is foolishness, because this life ends. And so we don't seek our own ability to remain in control. We seek to acknowledge that God is in control. If God is real, then we don't have to seek after our own comfort because we are here for a short time, not a long time. And when we're done, we know that God offers us surpassing comfort in his kingdom with the riches that he provides, with the encouragement that he gives. We might worry about our reputation and our acceptance. We might worry what people will think when they think of our name. We might worry about being recognized. And Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego's response tells us that if God is sitting on his throne, if there is a God who is able to save, then we don't have to seek acceptance from the kingdom of Babylon. Why? I mean, you can see where this is going. Because we seek God's acceptance. And God knows you more fully than anyone knows you. And God knows you more fully than you know yourself. And God says that you have dignity and value and you're worthy of respect and love. And God says you're a child of the King. And we talked back at the beginning of February about how Babylon tries to define the identity of these people. And it says your identity is based on your ability and your appearance and all of these external things. God gives another identity instead. He says your identity isn't based on your ability, it isn't based on your appearance, it isn't based on all of these external things, but those things would matter a lot more if this life was all that there is. Instead, your identity depends on whether you know yourself to be and accept that you are a child of God. And if you're a child of the King, then that means that you are royalty in his eyes, and you don't have to go to other things to find that acceptance. Moving on to security, this was the thing that was directly threatened for these men. You fall down and you worship the statue, or we will throw you into a fiery, burning hot furnace. The furnace is there because it was used to melt gold for the statue. You do that or you will die. And these friends say, even if that happens, following God is more important than that. Our lives belong to him. Our eternity is bound up with him. He gives us all the security we would ever need. We could worship our own sense of security, and we could make sure that we're good for now, and we could adjust our values to go along, to get along. But one day, what happens is that life will end for you and me. This life does not last forever, and we don't have any security against that. We could chase a false sense of security that only matters for this life if this is all that there is. But God gives us eternal security. He gives us security in his kingdom. He is the source of the only security that matters. And so the idols of the heart, these only make sense if this life is all that there is. Now each of us generally has one of these idols of comfort, control and acceptance, and comfort and security. And just to tip my cards here, I'm a person who, if I'm honest with myself, my tendency is that mine would be acceptance that I really struggle with. Here's the thing, if you worship acceptance, no one will ever call you on it. Because if you serve others and you care and you're reasonable and you try to hit all the goals that you're given and you seem like a nice guy and you want to help because you worship acceptance, when's the last time that anyone stood up in front of you and said, hey, I'm really concerned that you're trying to make me like you too much? You seem to just be doing so much for me lately and you're working so hard, you're trying to do everything that's needed. You better cut that out. I saw you volunteer at the animal shelter the other day. I think we need to talk about this. Right? No one calls you out on that, except that it is an idol. It is a thing that can take over our lives. If you look at your own life, you'll probably see one of these things that makes sense as something that's a consistent source of struggle for you as well. Okay, we're going to keep going. Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 to 23. Here's what it says. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to cast them into the fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. When they made that answer to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar realized for the first time in his life that he was truly powerless. There's a commentator that has this to say. She says, their refusal to comply with the king's order, despite the threat of the worst that he can inflict, exposes the limits of dictatorial power. Nebuchadnezzar literally has no power to enforce his command, to make the Jews behave like all the rest of his officials. He can kill them, but he cannot make them worship his God. Even if they should not be saved, in this matter they have more power than the king of Babylon. The recognition of this unforeseen reversal is what fuels Nebuchadnezzar's rage in verse 19. An observation by the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas clarifies the dynamics of such situations. She writes, I can wish to kill only that which exceeds my powers infinitely, and therefore does not oppose them, but paralyzes the very power of power. The other is the sole being I can wish to kill. The refusal of the 3 Jews exceeds Nebuchadnezzar's power infinitely, hence he desires to exterminate them. And when they answer the king this way, when they said, we don't care about the idols of Babylon because we worship God, in that moment Nebuchadnezzar realized he had nothing to offer them. He had nothing to threaten them with. He had nothing that they cared about. He had nothing that he could take away from them, not even their lives. He was angry because he truly realized in that moment that he and all the idols of his kingdom were nothing. And this can only be true if God is on the throne, if he exists and is able to save. And in fact, this is part of how God, in fact, is reaching out to Nebuchadnezzar. Think about it. The entire chapter is told from his perspective, We're told what it was that he saw. We're told what was reported to him by the Chaldeans. We're told that what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego said to him, but they don't have an individual voice. They speak as a group that report to Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, they're called Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, not because that's their names, but because they are called by their Hebrew names elsewhere in Daniel chapter 1 and 2. But they're called that because that's what Nebuchadnezzar knows them as. And so the next thing that we're told is what Nebuchadnezzar saw in verses 24 to 28. It says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste. We're seeing things as he sees them. He declared to his counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?' They answered and said to the king, 'True, O king.' He answered and said, 'But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods.'" In the midst of this, we see what Nebuchadnezzar saw, what God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to see, because even though we may be in this kingdom, in this world, even though we may have things taking up the center of all of our lives, God wants to be known by us, and he wants a relationship with us. Nebuchadnezzar looks into the furnace after his anger has consumed Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, and he looks and he sees that they are not harmed, and in fact there is someone with them. And in that moment, his heart is changed. He has realized that he is powerless. He realizes that there is a God who saves. He realizes if that's true, that changes some things. And he calls them out of the furnace. And this is what he says, going back into the passage where I left off, verse 28, just to the end of the chapter. It says, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and has delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command." He compliments them for disobeying him. "And yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins." He's still himself. He's got a bit to learn. "For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So here's what happens. Here's how much God cares about the kingdom of Babylon. He doesn't just keep the Hebrews in Israel, but he sends them out not just as punishment, but as a witness to the nations. Throughout chapters 1 to 3, 1 to 4, we see this increasing rebellion against the values of Babylon as more and more people are won to the cause of the God of Israel. It starts with the chief of the eunuchs in chapter 1, then on to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard in chapter 2, and now it's Nebuchadnezzar himself. And not only is it Nebuchadnezzar, but through him, it's all the nations. Think about it, all the nations and all the tribes and all the tongues. God is calling all people to himself. He's not centered on one group of people, but has called everyone, everywhere, in all times and all places, of every language and every culture, to himself, to know him, because he wants to save all people, and he loves all people, and he's pursuing all people, and he'll pursue Nebuchadnezzar. And through Nebuchadnezzar, he'll make himself known to the nations of the earth. And so we see God who isn't just content to leave Israel or us in their idolatry. He calls us back to himself. He sends us into exile so that he can call Nebuchadnezzar to himself. He calls Nebuchadnezzar to himself so he can call the whole world to know and follow him. Why? So that they don't have to bow down before the idol that Nebuchadnezzar has set up, or any other idols, any of these idols. Not to be in bondage to these things or captivity to these things, but to be freed from the claims of the world upon them, and be freed to worship God who gives all things freely, without you or me or anyone else being kept in bondage and chains. It's about who God is. It's about the fact that God is faithful in exile, that he is good and he is gracious, and he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we can bow down and we can worship him because he alone is God. He alone is worthy of our worship. He alone is worthy of our trust. He alone is our 4th man in the fire, who saves us when all the idols of our lives are powerless. He alone is our God and our Savior, in whom we can fully place our trust. Because like the song we sang just before the message says, He will never fail. Let me pray.